Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, I'm going to have an open-ended conversation with Carl Abrahamsson. He is a writer of both fiction and nonfiction. He calls himself a magico-anthropologist. He is a filmmaker and a photographer and a magician and a musician. And he is also the author of Occult, The Unseen Forces That Drive Culture Forward, a book about the relationship between culture and the occult. And that will be the main focus of our conversation today. We did a previous interview based on his recent documentary titled Anton LaVey, Into the Devil's Den, and we looked at the Church of Satan. He's also the publisher of the annual anthology of occult called The Fenris Wolf. He has published a series of essays, lectures, and interviews called Resonances. Another one of his films is called Cinemagician, Conversations with Kenneth Anger. Another film is titled Lunacy, which is a film praising lunar forces and witches from all times and spaces. Yet another of his films is called Poems Are Living Things. Once again, this is an internet interview, and I'll switch over now to the internet video. Welcome, Carl. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here again.
In your book titled Occult, you refer to the hidden forces that drive culture forward. And by that, I presume you're referring to what we conventionally call the occult. Maybe you could amplify that a little bit. Let's start there.
Although you could say that it's about occultism in a way, but not everybody of these people I've written about have been involved or enmeshed in the occult in the sense of arcane rituals or ritual magic, but they have worked with forces that have not been accepted by the mainstream. That's really the bottom line in my own definition in a way. So someone who works outside or underneath the surface, like underground, literally. So how things are being changed in culture, in greater culture, you could look at that from many different perspectives or different goggles. It could be sociological, it could be anthropological, it could be political in many ways. But when you start scratching the surface, you find that many of the key people who really instigated change have had some kind of interest that goes beyond the merely causal, so to speak. And the more they praise or value their own psychological process consciously and their own working with their mind, basically, then you see that they come up with things, ideas, notions, epiphanies in ways that are not accepted at their particular point in time and space. So I think that's one red thread that I saw there. But then, of course, most of these people that I write about in the book, whether it's magicians like Crowley and LaVey, and or authors like Paul Bowles and and Rudolph Steiner, who was a bit of he had his feet in many worlds in a way, they are all aware of the fact they take care of a legacy somehow, a literary or an esoteric, but they reshape it. And that's the real magic of these people. They reshape it, they synthesize things and express it anew in their own language. And that's exactly, if you go into this discussion of memes and memetics and things that affect our culture today online, in our online culture, it's like some things take on a life. So I guess what unites all of these people who I claim have affected this change in culture is their valuing, their own validation of their own individual, and I dare to say it, intuitive process. That's very important.
Let me push a little bit further, because while you were speaking, the first thing that came to mind was Sir Isaac Newton, who valued his work in alchemy more than his work in physics. And yet his work in physics sort of set the scientific mechanistic trend of Western culture. Many would say, looking back on it today, kind of in a negative direction. So what I want to ask you is, what do you think it means to say moves culture forward as opposed to backward?
I think that there is a kind of dilemma also when you mention Newton, for instance, and this kind of where an intuition becomes a two-edged sword. He was stuck in his time, but we can evaluate him and evaluate ourselves in similar dilemmas. It's like we come up with one thing and it's, good or beneficial for us or for a little group of people, but it could also be very bad for other people at the same time. So whatever we come up with when it comes to things that have the possible connection with a greater group of people or a society or again a culture, then we have cold-hearted materialist utilitarianism on one side, which is, of course, a remnant or a heritage from a very rationalistic, materialistic heritage. And then on the other hand, you have this thing which, I guess jokingly or endearingly has been called New Age. I don't even know what that means anymore, because it's simply so many things stuffed under, I guess, an irrational umbrella. That's the thing. You have this hyper-rational world in which, a religious belief in statistics, really rules our world in many ways. But on the other hand, we have this hyper irrationalistic mind frame. And I think, of course, everybody, all the wisdoms of the world say that, perhaps the two shall never meet, but we should at least attempt to meet in the middle to see what common ground there is and to create like a healthier, more wise merger, a synthesis. And I think that's what makes today so interesting, because all of these things are out in the open. It's not like the worlds are completely esoteric. And that's another thing, like, using the term occult. Things were occult. Radical ideas were occult for a reason. They were there, it's a question of protection from other power structures, protection from, leaking and disseminating wisdom to people who couldn't understand it. There are many aspects to that. But now, we all know that, any kind of rare occult manuscript, we can just like Google and we'll find it. And it's no longer a quest. It's more like an anti-quest in a way. And of course, to find it on the internet doesn't mean that you can, integrate it and make yourself a more wise person. On the contrary. But what I'm after here is that the scientific tradition has been predominant, but now suddenly, and I guess through, in a way, these occult tendencies and occult thinkers have taken more and more place in the mainstream. And that has actually happened mostly via culture. There we have to ask, what is this really all about? I would say that the scientific rational mind frame is a remnant. It's a pretty clear, and I would call it religious. It's a religious remnant, not of monotheism, but simply belief in the law of probability. On the other hand, I think this, let's call it then the New Age umbrella, because it contains so many different things. There, I think these people or this Agrigore or cluster is confronting something that is very important today, and that's our survival instinct. That has, usually been the role of the artist or the creative person, to filter unconscious, subconscious signals about, what kind of state is the world in, and then express that in their own particular creative way to affect people, not necessarily rationally, not necessarily with information, but with emotion that in turn can make them realize, whoa, this, now I understand this statistics and this sort of potential disaster that's going on, because most people will not sit down with the scientific tracts and look at the statistics, but they can be moved.
You used a word. I want to make sure I understood it. Did I hear you say Agrigore?
Yeah.
And then you said, if I recall correctly, a cluster, an egregore or a cluster. Let's amplify on that.
Simply when one or more, two or more things unite, you have a cluster. And when that contains something that transcends the mere numeric volume and integrates philosophy, integrates communal view, then you could say that it becomes like an egregore, a new kind of core that has the power by volume to affect things further. The way I first heard about that word is definitely within magical communities. You talked about the magical egregore, but that for me, it's equally usable, applicable in again in greater culture. An egregore is united not by unity of traditional things like race or ethnicity or political views. It's something more pragmatic, and there could be an egregore of communal goals, for instance. I guess you could say that civil rights, civil liberties, that's one kind of egregore where people from many different directions come and unite and create a cluster by number, but also an egregore of force. So it's basically like a new kind of core that contains the power to change things because it has, I guess, a spirit in a way.
Now, I bring it up because one of my other guests, one of our most popular guests, you may not be familiar with, or you may be, Jason Reza Georgiani, philosopher. He is developing I'm going to call it a new theology. He calls it Prometheism. And he suggests that Prometheus, the Greek titan who stole the fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, is an egregore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I would probably say that what's actually constituting the egregore is when people realize the force of Prometheus, and that it's like we talked about last time about this potent symbol of Satan. Of course, there are many similarities between Prometheus and Lucifer specifically, in the sense that you bring something to humans that they're not supposed to have, whether it's the fire from Mount Olympus, or whether it's like free will and the right to pleasure and sort of this radical Epicureanism in a way. So I can certainly see what he means by that. And I think Prometheus is perhaps a more usable term in a way today than Satan is, because Satan will always be tainted by the monotheistic garb. You can't escape that because it stems from this dualistic thinking. Prometheus and the Greek pantheon and of course philosophy of antiquity is in many ways much more useful in the sense that it's not tainted with value. It's something that is the foundation of Western civilization. We find the philosophers, and we find art and drama and literature with such a vastly wealthy and rich culture. So it's not surprising. I mean, there are many people still using, in terms of finding good metaphors, good analogies, they still stick with the Greek pantheon, and I can see why. Absolutely.
Well, I'm under the impression, from what little I know really, that the idea of the egregore, to me, it's sort of like what the Tibetans call the tulpa, a thought form generated by humans, maybe, as you say, an aggregation of humans. It takes on a life of its own. It becomes like a ghost, a specter, an independent entity that interacts with human culture in some form.
Absolutely. I totally ascribe to that. And history is interesting because we can see, even though there have, of course, been secret agents and stuff like that, we can see, though, history as what do you call it, a board game, and you can analyze the game, how it was played in certain times. Today it's slightly more complicated because so much is it's covert in the open, and mainly because of the internet. And Anton LaVey had some interesting things to say about that. He talked very much about the invisible war, and today that has much more value than when he came up with it, because if you see, for instance, that we are no longer fighting an information war, but it's more like a disinformation war. It's no longer a war of signal, it's a war of noise. And that, of course, is a strategy. People don't want to shout the loudest, hey, listen to me, listen to my arguments because I'm right. They instead use other means on the internet, by social media, and instead of saying what you believe in, you focus on the people who do not believe like you and sort of smear campaigning instead. And I think of course that's shame. It's like moral outrage, but you can't escape it. It's just the way it is. History has never been static. The game on this game board changes all the time, and that's what makes it so fascinating. However, I think it will be very, very difficult for the people, historians of the future, because you always need data. You always need data to look through and analyze. And up until recently, there were newspapers and archives and books, and to a certain degree, magnetic electronic media. But today, what happens if there's a solar flare and all the internet is gone and all the hard drives is gone? It's just like it's not back to square one, but we're going to be moved back like 100 years in time and have to rethink things. It's a fascinating thing, and I'm sure it will happen at some point.
When I think of culture moving forward, because I'm a parapsychologist, I like to think that what we're engaged in is a kind of fusion of the scientific method with what people called at one time the rising tide of superstition or the irrational, trying to find the golden thread of truth in all of this new age one of my friends calls it newage, to rhyme with sewage. Mm-hmm. And it strikes me that if culture is to move forward, it's kind of like the evolution of the human being, and to own what people, the vanguard of people, highly gifted clairvoyants and psychics, come to own that more. And that's the birthright, I tend to think, of all people ultimately, although it's only recognized right now by, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3% of the culture.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think in our particular cultural sphere, I think it has to do a lot with the very negative imperialism of monotheism, where people who have real abilities to heal, for instance, or real abilities to see, natural shamans in a way, where they are suddenly just ridiculed from the time that they're children. Of course, they will go into hiding. They will become occult then, which can, of course, lead to more ostracizing maneuvers from the outside, or like a self-isolation in a way. So it has been a very bad culture for teaching people that they have potential. They have much more potential than they have been brought up to believe. So it's almost like it's a culture where you put the lid on the pot when it starts boiling, but that's actually when it should be just allowed to boil and cook some new dishes and see what's happening. But the culture as such has always been, now psychology is accepted. That wasn't the case from the beginning 100 years ago or slightly more. And what we, as a joint term, could call parapsychology is not really accepted. Although, I'm sure things are opening up too. It's a vast field, of course, but some areas I think will be looked into in a serious, scientific way. I think telepathy and these different kinds of other kinds of interhuman communications, for instance. And you only have to go to the communication of other, of plants, for instance, how one society or group, or again cluster of fern or these things that really grow together in a way, how they can communicate via their roots. Like if one is uprooted, the other ones will know it. Things like that. So I think it's not a matter of anymore. It's no longer a matter of just oppose progress for the sake of it, I mean, for religious reasons. I think scientists today are generally more open-minded, and I would suspect that it has to do with a general kind of openness that has to do with culture, influencing these things. And I mean, I was trying to find an example. We can't relate to it, but there was a film recently about, I think it was called The Current War. It was about Edison and Tesla and Westinghouse, them working together and just deciding arbitrarily whether to have AC/DC or just AC. These things that for us it's like it's so normal, but when you think of it, it's really kind of complex and very powerful energies at work. And there were these three guys, competing like little alpha males in the sandbox in a way of how to do this. And of course, they were all geniuses in their own ways. There were just three singular people with a vision that really changed our lives in a similar ways. The people at the American universities who came up with this interconnectivity ideas that became the internet, and they had all tried LSD, and these things happen, and it happens when the time is right. The same thing why psychology popped up and actually did become quite accepted in a fairly short amount of time. And I think that's going to keep happening. I can see definitely a more liberal, in a way, a more tolerant, a more open-minded attitude in the scientific communities, because you can criticize them for historically having looked to grants, having looked to patents, having looked at things that have to do with pecuniary matters. But at the same time, society at large, the culture at large, has changed to now totally embody a deep-rooted anxiety about, what the hell is going on? Is this a good thing? Is this a good trajectory? No, it's not. So better start, turning the tanker and steer it in a different direction.
With regard to psychology, it seems to me that really the most influential voice in psychology over the last century has probably been that of Freud. And Freud, especially at the cultural level, less amongst academic psychologists, but what Freud introduced was the idea of the unconscious, and the Freudian unconscious is filled with things that we don't want to know about ourselves, that we have dark motives that we hide from ourselves because they're not culturally acceptable. And it seems to me, as long as we're hiding from ourselves, it's very difficult for clairvoyance to be around. I once had an opportunity to ask Arthur C. Clarke, the great science fiction writer who spoke at Berkeley when I was a student, and he had been making some very negative, hostile comments about Uri Geller, the Israeli psychic. So I asked him, I said, Mr. Clarke, do you believe in ESP? Because his novels are full of it. And he said to me, I thought this was very revealing. He said, no, I do not believe in ESP because I don't want anybody to read my mind.
Well, I think it's at least probably an honest answer, because who would want that? But at the same time, it could also, again, this two-edged sword thing, because if you could look into someone's mind, you could also have a deeper kind of communication that is not based on dishonesty. Those communications would need to be honest in a way, because you can't really formulate your own inner emotions and thoughts as being, strategically deviant from a real communication. But I just wanted to say also, you mentioned Clarke, and that is very interesting, because one very clear, discernible way that culture affected, or culture affected the larger culture, that's simply through science fiction in a way. Small, very bright science fiction writers, radical. They were, first in the pulp magazines. They were not regarded as literature. They were just entertainment for boys and girls. And but many of these things, only a couple of decades later, was an actual reality. And flying to the moon, who could have foreseen that? And most of those people who were instrumental in engineering that had been reading these sort of pulp magazines. And so it's kind of funny is not the right word. It's interesting to see how this kind of lowbrow culture that has to do with you growing up, how seminal those things can be. I recently read something by Joseph Campbell, a person I really admire, and he said that the thing that created timelessness for you when you grew up, that's where your own myth begins. Meaning that what could set you sort of out of the boundaries of time and space and sort of enchant you as a child, that's where your myth begins. And I think that's the power of culture also. You really affect kids and kids' minds more with entertainment in a way, or fiction, rather than with mechanical schooling.
I know when I was a young boy, I read comic books like most young children do. I read Superman was my hero, and though they become very inspirational, and I did have an opportunity to converse with Jeffrey Kripal, a professor of religious studies, who noted that many of the great comic book writers were deeply interested in the occult.
Oh, I bet. Absolutely. And, Superman is also an interesting example to again tie it in with Anton LaVey. He said that, because people called LaVey pop Nietzsche. It was Nietzsche for an American audience in a way. And you could see that any kind of philosophy of will it comes from Schopenhauer, but it's filtered via Nietzsche. But LaVey said, funnily, because he was also very, very enamored with American pop culture. He grew up in the 30s and 40s, the sort of the golden age of American comics. And he said that, very, very truly, it's like without Nietzsche, there would be no Superman. And Superman was so quintessentially important for American kids and for American culture.
Now, speaking of Superman, I do recall many followers of Rudolph Steiner, about whom you've written, referred to him as the embodiment of the Nietzschean Übermensch, the idea that Steiner was so accomplished as a sculptor, as an architect, as a founder of an educational institution, as a founder of schools of medicine and biology, not to mention, of course, philosophy. They thought of him as the living embodiment of what Nietzsche had been writing about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very, very interesting. And of course, Steiner is a very, very interesting character. In the book, in the Occulture book, I have a chapter sort of comparing Aleister Crowley with Rudolf Steiner, because there are many similarities. They both concocted their own syntheses based on previous thing. Crowley had the Golden Dawn, Steiner had Theosophy, and yet they made something new and made movements out of it. And so there are many similarities, but to stay with a Nietzschean Agrigore in a way. It's so funny because Steiner was it's like 100% Apollonian, and Crowley was like 100% Dionysian. So they're almost like, I would not say twins, I wouldn't go that far, but they are very interesting as truly opposing poles, yet they carry the same trajectory. albeit in different ways. But the similarities are striking, but as types, they are so completely opposed, I would say.
Well, it's interesting because Steiner has left behind a very organized group of people who continue on in his teachings and so on. Crowley has left behind, I would say, a very disorganized following for the most part. Many diverse groups of pagans and occultists look up to Crowley in different ways, but they don't seem to embody any of the discipline and institutional culture that one finds amongst anthroposophists.
Mm-hmm. No, it's absolutely true. And I mean, I early on, like from my teens and on up until fairly recently, I was a big, I wouldn't say Crowley fan, but I was an actual, student and engaged in the philosophy, and I could really ascribe to most of the things. And I found his best quality was this capacity for synthesis, like integrating things from the East and also taking some good parts from the Western tradition, but mainly it's the philosophy of thelema, of will. But then again, there's really nothing that these sort of Anglo-Saxon occultists have formulated that wasn't surpassed earlier on by Germans. You could go to, of course, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and Goethe and all these superior minds, if I may say so. And I think also Crowley has many entries of attraction for young people. Is this the archetype of the rebel? Is this he did everything? He was a bad boy, and yet he was very suave and aristocratic. But also his life was pretty much a mess. He had a voluminous output, but there was no order. And then you can make virtue out of necessity and say that, well, that's just how he wanted to lead his life. I don't think so. I think he would have preferred a much more, sophisticated lifestyle without pecuniary problems, I have to say. But there are other levels to this too. I think that for me, one of the turnoffs that actually made me lose interest in Crowley was, he was a child of his time, and there was this burgeoning of very great expanses and developments in the natural sciences, for instance. And at the same time, he came from so that's one thing, the empirical method. It was big in the zeitgeist. On the other hand, he came from a very strictly, Christian conservative background. So of course he rebelled and took, I'm the great beast, 666, whatever. But at the same time, he had that in his blood. It wasn't just the rebellion. He had that, Old Testament mind frame. And of course, what does he do when he gets so turned on that he writes his epiphanic text? Well, he calls himself a prophet. And those things are, for me, two no-nos. And he summarized it well in something that is now like a decree, something that is looked upon with admiration. He said that, the method of science, the aim of religion, inherently meaning that he's the prophet of that religion. And for me, that's a double no-no. The empirical method is something that dates back to I don't know, the early 19th century, and it should have been left there. And as for the religion, the aim of religion, I don't know, it's not a good association. Religion is mostly associated with oppression, imperialism, monotheism, and it doesn't really help if you just adopt an Egyptian pantheon and think that people will swallow that. It's not going to happen.
Well, if you reject the method of science and the aim of religion, what are you left with?
You're left with an unprejudiced, open mind with a highly skilled and developed intuition, but mainly a tolerance, because since you don't have those strict limits and boundaries that you set upon yourself by adhering rigidly to a method, for instance. Because again, empiricism, what is it? It's the religious adherence to statistics. Because if you make 100 successful attempts in a laboratory, then you assume, well, we did 100, so thereby we are harnessing the truth based on statistics. But what if the 101st experiment topsy-turvies everything? Is that then just an anomaly, or was it a wrong application of the method? No, it's the same. So you can, from a strictly utilitarian perspective, of course you can do that, like clinical laboratory work in developing medicines and stuff like that. It's beautiful stuff. But in terms, to adhere to a materialistic empirical regime is to negate your own potential. It's to negate your own belief in the fact that your intuition has value. Because what if your intuition says, I'll go against the grain here, even though that group is successful and established, they claim one thing that I feel. My intuition tells me this is completely wrong. And you could argue also that any kind of, communal movement, do they claim to have the truth or the falsehood? Of course, they always claim to have the truth. Let's stay in Nazi Germany. The main part of the people, not just the ruling elite, but many people subscribe to the theories. And then ergo, that would imply that there is some kind of, empirical truth in what they're saying simply because of the number, So in that sense, sometimes democracy is not the best way to run a country, but it's probably the best one we have. But what I'm saying is that at least as someone who's on a quest, you could call it spiritual or magical, whatever, you have to be true first and foremost to yourself. And if someone says something that you're supposed to believe in and you don't believe in it, then of course you should stick with your own regimen, your own attitude, your own results. And if you look at, I would say, interestingly enough, the history of science, many of the epiphanies that have created pivotal changes have come from deeply irrational, deeply unempirical methods that have then gone on to be verified in a way. But I usually say, to not to mock, but to provoke empiricists, what's the foundation of empiricism? And they will most often answer, well, it's our method. But actually, the foundation of empiricism is, and this is what they don't like to hear, it's speculation. Because you cannot even postulate a theory if you don't have several speculations that can be gelled into something that can be taken into an experimental environment. So my experience is that they don't want to integrate that question, or saying that the foundation of empiricism is speculation, pure and simple. I argue that it is.
I want to shift gears a little bit with you. Earlier, you talked about the distinction between the Anglo-Saxon world and the Germanic culture. And you are in Stockholm right now. I'm in Albuquerque. I'm totally immersed in Anglo-Saxon culture, but you are in a world where you're really close to both of them. You're obviously very fluent in English, but I'm going to assume, maybe wrongly, that your first language is probably Swedish.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
You have more of a perspective on the Anglo-Saxon world from the outside than I have. I've always been on the inside.
Yes, absolutely. But then again, you have this thing which you can, it's not a matter of accepting it or not. It's just there. You have a huge influx here, as well as in the rest of the world, actually, of American cultural imperialism. And I remember, it affected me greatly in very good ways. That's why I basically, love a lot of American culture, maybe, pop culture and sort of B movies and sort of the slightly discarded things. But that's what I grew up with, because the fact that on Swedish TV, when I grew up, there were only 2 channels, and anything that was broadcast was usually stuff from England, from the UK, but also a lot of American films, of course, and they were not dubbed. They were with subtitles. So Swedish kids learned English really quickly, and then from age 9 or 10 in school. So that's one part of it. But the other part is, of course, the power of American cultural imperialism. With movies, with music, we are immersed in it whether we want it or not. So I think that's never going to go away, and it may be irrevocable. I'm not saying that it has to be revoked. I don't think it's possible. But what we can see now with the internet is that it's even more predominant in a way, because kids watch YouTube and they watch, American reality shows, and it's just I don't know. I kind of both love and hate that expression, reality shows, because it's a show of fiction, but it's supposed to be about reality, which of course is not everybody's reality. It's just a certain number of perhaps not so intelligent people. But concerning the Germanic, if you think back as a Swedish person, for instance, where our culture, what are the roots, what are the sources, and there's a lot of influx, like in our language, for instance, we do have a lot of English words, but we also have, of course, it's a Germanic language, so the structure is there, but we also have a lot of words from the French in Swedish that have become sort of Swedified. So I think culturally it's a mix, and I think also the current we have a monarchy and we have a king, but it's not really stemming from a Swedish bloodline. It was like a political thing that happened in the early 19th century, where Napoleon basically said, you go and be king over Sweden, and that's what happened. And that family is still doing a pretty good job. So I'm not complaining, but it's interesting to see that it's not ancient history. Our world in Sweden has been shaped by very strong forces in history, and we have always retained a very diplomatic approach. Like officially, we're neutral, for instance, in terms of international politics. We have not been in a war for over 200 years. Things like that. It's kind of unheard of, but it gives us a kind of a character trait where we are both alone, but we're also part of everything, like good diplomats in a way. We can go into many different environments and converse and maybe be sly, maybe be strategic, maybe stay out of trouble. But it's based on the fact that there has always been input, mainly from the European main hubs, Germany, France, and England. Those have defined our culture. And then I would say during the 20th century, it was this wave, this tsunami coming from America and sort of engulfing all of it.
One of the areas of interest of our viewers is the whole question of aliens from outer space. And amongst the various aliens people talk about are they call them the mantids, like giant insects. There are the greys, and then there are the Nordics. So the Nordics are tall with blue eyes and blonde hair, and they are often described as sort of the most elevated of the alien beings. I think of them as sort of egregores, but because they're called Nordics, obviously there seems to be some connection there with you and Sweden and the Nordic countries. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
There were even some Swedish scientists, like in the 17th century, who claimed that Atlantis was basically situated in Sweden, and all of these meteor lakes that we have, that's something came down into that lake in the middle of Sweden. So, but this is just like speculation and bordering on not even mythology, but bordering on certain person's fantasies. You could also see it very clearly when the Ariosophists came to cultural power first in Austria and then Germany, and how that seeped into politics and became a whole thing, this yearning for the Nordic in a way. And it's so funny too, because it does exist still exists in real life. And I'm not talking specifically about us being aliens, but I'm talking, for instance, about Germans have this incredibly romantic view of Sweden in particular, I would say, more so than Denmark and Norway. And I don't know why. It's a big thing for Germans to have a Swedish summer house. Scandinavians are really big on their summer houses, and they're all kind of homogeneous. They're painted in red with white windows, and it's just very, very cute. Cute is a good word. And for a long time, it's not a politicized thing, but they've always had this kind of idealized view of Sweden, and I think that was very clear during the Nazi era too. For mostly for bad, of course, but who knows? We were never invaded, and I'm sure there were many political strategies going on, and maybe some shady deals. I don't know, but I mean, for instance, Norway was invaded, Denmark was invaded, but Sweden wasn't. So either very skillful diplomacy, or simply a kind of respect for us that we couldn't explain at the time, certainly, and still can't. So I'm not so sure about the Nordic aliens. Sometimes I feel alienated, but that's a completely different thing. On that topic, though, it's interesting to see, and that itself is a study, why so many of the alien cultures, or I would say maybe even subcultures, people adhere, almost like in fiction, to a certain type, like you say, like they're hominoids, or they're Nordics, or they're different kinds of, what did you call them, arachnid, something that to do with insects.
Mantids, and there's the reptilians, and
right, exactly. But the thing is, to connect things with what's going on today also, there is alien invasion going on all the time, but it's not in that kind of life form. There's bacteria coming into our atmosphere, and this virus is coming into our atmosphere from space. And how they take on new forms and how they mutate, that could actually be something that has to do with what's going on today with pandemics and stuff, because you can try to isolate and say that, it was this, fish market or animal market in Wuhan in China, and they did this. How the hell can they do that? How they isolate like billions of people down to this point in time and space? It's I don't know. But then again, how can you trace the origins of viruses in general? It's an established fact that things seep into our atmosphere. That's not science fiction. It's not a conspiracy theory. That's typically empirical knowledge. So in that sense, we are being invaded by aliens, but they're not really anthropomorphic.
Now, I've heard the same thing being said about psychedelic mushroom spores, for example.
Yeah. No, I love that, and let's just accept that as a theory for now. But I love that because that's exactly, why would someone want to come here, for instance? Well, it could be to, like, if from our human mind frame, it would be to rob us of our riches, to exploit the planet and then leave again. But it could also be from a slightly more, altruistic point of view, maybe to help us and to guide us. I mean, that's how ancient religious cultures have left behind documentation too of visitations and having been given technologies and stuff like that. But I personally love the fact that spores or fungi, and I'm not talking about this from a Lovecraftian perspective. I'm talking more of it from psychedelics as being a mind opener, in the sense, hey people, it's time to wake up and see things in a more holistic light. Because if you sort of destroy your habitat, this planet, it will disturb a balance on a cosmic scale also. We are so narrow-minded. We think, from an anthropocentric, not even a what do you call it, Earth-centric. It's only anthropocentric, whereas, of course, if something really bad happens and sort of we lose ecological balance, and there's a new ice age, and of course that affects the rest of at least our solar system. And there may be, or there may be not, forces that like that, or don't like that, I mean, and say that, hey, people, wake up. So what do we do? Well, since we can't speak any of the Earth languages, and if we show up in our spacecraft, they would just kill us, let's give them some psychedelic spores and hope for the best.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end on, Carl. I love this conversation because I have the feeling that we could keep going for a long time. We could talk about practically anything, and you will have
Absolutely.
interesting things to say. So I want to thank you for being with me. This has been a delight, and I look forward to future conversations with you.
Yeah, me too, Jeffrey. Thank you very much. It's been great, and we'll just keep the flame burning, as Prometheus would say.
Beautiful. And for those of you watching, thank you for being with us.